Welcome to Liverpool, one of the world's great cities, and a cradle of British maritime history, the hometown of countless legendary musicians, two of England's most successful football clubs, and a spectacular array of gorgeous architecture, grand landmarks and captivating city streets. On this in-depth 80-minute tour of Liverpool's enthralling city centre, we'll take a deep dive into the city's illustrious history, as we pass by landmarks including the mighty Liverpool Cathedral, the Royal Albert Dock, Chinatown, and the Cavern Club, where the Beatles famously made their name as they rose to superstardom. However, we begin on Pier Head, part of Liverpool's magnificent waterfront. Historically, Pier Head, or to call it by its proper name, George's Pier Head, was the site of the George's Dock, one of the main docks of the port of Liverpool in the 18th and 19th centuries. After the George's Dock became redundant at the turn of the 20th century, it was filled in to create Pier Head here, a marvellous waterfront location, most famous for the three beautiful buildings before us. These are the Three Graces of Liverpool, a trio of imposing landmarks that overlook the River Mersey and the historic centre of Liverpool's maritime legacy. On the right is the oldest of the Three Graces, the Port of Liverpool building, built over 4 years and completed in 1907, when it became the tallest building in Liverpool for its time. Its grand, ornate design was intended to reflect the importance of Liverpool in the development and maintenance of the British Empire. And for 87 years, the Port of Liverpool building was the headquarters of the Mersey Dock and Harbour Board. But today it's just one part of this breathtaking trio of city landmarks. Next door is the smallest of the Three Graces, the Cunard building, which was built in 1917 as the headquarters of the Cunard Line, a cruise line company originally based in Liverpool, and which operated huge transatlantic voyages from this city to Halifax in Canada and Boston in the United States. And along from the Cunard, meanwhile, is the Royal Liver building, perhaps the most famous of the Three Graces. Constructed in 1911 as an office building, it's famously topped with the statues of two liver birds, the symbols of Liverpool. Looking over the Mersey and the historic waterfront, legend has it that if the two birds on the liver building were to fly away, then the city of Liverpool would cease to exist. We'll talk more about the myth of the liver birds later on in our walk, but speaking of statues, in front of us we can see one of King Edward VII on horseback, and at the foot of the Three Graces, a famous sculpture of none other than the Beatles. Yes, John, Paul, George and Ringo, probably the four most famous Liverpudlians of the 20th century, are depicted strolling through their hometown here in this larger-than-life statue of 2015, which has become an instant hit among visitors to Liverpool. Since their rise to international stardom as one of the greatest bands in history, the Beatles have become a major part of Liverpool's magnificent cultural sphere, with an entire quarter of the modern city, the Cavern Quarter, dedicated to the impact of the Beatles and the many other groundbreaking music acts who emerged from Liverpool in the mid-20th century. We'll visit the Cavern Quarter, Mathew Street and all the other Beatles hotspots in the city centre as we continue our walk. But for now, let's stay on Pier Head, where we can learn about the origins of Liverpool as we know it today. As the former site of one of the city's main docks, and still the landing place for many enormous ferries that arrive and depart, Pier Head is the centre of Liverpool's maritime history, and for a long time, this area was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, celebrating just that. Paradoxically, the impressive development and modernisation of Pier Head led to Liverpool being stripped of its World Heritage status in 2021, but that doesn't mean that this sleek waterfront lacks a rich cultural heritage. Across the gargantuan River Mersey, we can see the town of Birkenhead on the Wirral Peninsula. Though today connected by a huge road tunnel under the river, Birkenhead and Liverpool have been linked over the water by ferries for the best part of 900 years. Back in the mid-12th century, Birkenhead was the site of a monastery, and its monks would row passengers across the river for a small fee. These were the earliest origins of the ferry across the Mersey, and to this day, at least 2 boats still carry people, each with their own secret care, on this same historic route every day. Looking out across the river towards the sea beside a statue of Captain Johnnie Walker, a heroic naval commander in the Battle of the Atlantic during the Second World War, there's centuries and centuries of history to be explored, even on a brief stroll around Pier Head, which, along with often windy weather coming off the Irish Sea, is often home to a wonderful atmosphere as people come down to the waterfront to relax. Also the site of the brand new and enormous Museum of Liverpool, opened in 2011, the surrounding landmarks make Pier Head a truly spectacular place to be. But one thing you might not have known about this area is that Liverpool's famous 3 Graces were once 4. Further away from where we are now, roughly on the site of the modern Liverpool 1 development, there stood the Grand Custom House, a beautiful mid-19th century building that served as part of the city's dock offices. Much beloved by the people of Liverpool at its time, the Custom House was unfortunately destroyed in part by bombs in 1941, during the Liverpool Blitz, and after the war it was demolished, much to the anger of many people in the city. After the turn of the 21st century, there were a slew of plans to construct a new 4th Grace of Liverpool around Pier Head, although none came off. And I think the city's 3 Graces are a more than adequate symbol of this spectacular waterfront. But as we now make our way off Pier Head and towards the heart of the city, why exactly did Liverpool's port become so important and so prosperous? Well, simply put, Liverpool was arguably the most important port in Britain in the 19th century. Along with over 9 million people departing for a new life in the New World from this point, the port here was a crucial arm in the development of trade in the British Empire, handling more than a quarter of all imports and exports at the height of the imperial period. However, Liverpool's port also rose to prominence in the 18th century on the back of a particularly dark trade, with more than 80% of all of Britain's slave ships departing from this city during the 1790s. Now, the vast majority of buildings in Liverpool today, like the George's Dock ventilation building towering above us here, were built long after the abolition of slavery in Britain. While Liverpool had progressed significantly during its time as the empire's central point of slave trading, its port continued to develop dramatically throughout the 19th century, particularly with the boom of industry in towns and cities across northern England that took focus away from London and the former main port city of Bristol. At the end of our walk across the city, we'll take a stroll around the historic Royal Albert Dock, at one point the crucible of Liverpool's thriving port activity, and which is beautifully preserved today alongside much of the city's waterfront. Here, a block behind the waterfront, we find ourselves on the Strand, a major wide-open road lined with modern skyscrapers and office blocks. But among all of those modern buildings, there stands what is actually one of the oldest buildings in central Liverpool today. This colourful edifice of 1898 is Albion House, originally built for a shipping company known as Ismay Imrie & Co., which managed one of the famous names in Liverpool's history, White Star Line. White Star Line, one of the great cruise lines of the early 20th century, was founded in Liverpool back in 1845, and most famously, it was the owner of the RMS Titanic, the largest ship of its day, but which of course sank after colliding with an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic in 1912. The Titanic, though built in Belfast and having departed on that fateful voyage from Southampton, is another famous part of Liverpool's maritime heritage, and Albion House here, now a hotel, features a collection of luxurious rooms inspired by the grace and splendour you'd have been met with on the Titanic. Elsewhere in Liverpool, there's also a monument to the heroes of the engine room on board the Titanic when it sank, an exhibition dedicated to the Titanic in the city's Maritime Museum, and countless more landmarks that tell the story of the famous ship. But we now find ourselves walking up away from the waterfront along James Street, where we're passing by Liverpool James Street station. One of the main stops in the centre of Liverpool on the extensive Merseyrail network, James Street is one of a pair of pioneering stations to be found in the Merseyside area. The station was opened back in 1886 as one end of the new Mersey Railway Tunnel, which ran underneath the river towards Hamilton Square Station in Birkenhead, with their platforms located nearly 200 feet beneath the ground here, far deeper than any London Underground stations at the time. Though a famous maritime city, it's Liverpool's rail infrastructure that stands out as a distinctive feature today. Liverpool is one of just 5 British cities with its own underground rapid transit system, the others being London, Glasgow, and a combined network in Newcastle and Sunderland. Most of the Merseyrail system admittedly runs above ground, but it reaches far and wide across the county of Merseyside, from 4 main stations in the centre of Liverpool, towards destinations including Southport, Chester, the North Wirral Peninsula, and more. Of course, with a population of around 500,000, Liverpool sits at the heart of the Merseyside region today, but it wasn't always that way. Here on Derby Square, we find a particularly grand monument of Queen Victoria, which was unveiled here in the heart of the city in 1906. However, for much of Liverpool's history, this square was the site of a castle, which stood for nearly 500 years. While nothing of Liverpool Castle remains, this point of the city offers us some intriguing clues as to Liverpool's earliest origins. The castle is thought to have been built sometime between 1232 and 1247, and it was built here because this was the highest point in the area at the time. This allowed the castle to have an expansive view over the riverside area known as the Pool, historically a small inlet off the River Mersey where ships would shelter. Under the reign of King John in the 13th century, however, the Pool began to develop into a small port, and Liverpool Castle was built to protect it. An impressive building for centuries, Liverpool Castle's downfall came with its role in the English Civil War. Initially, Liverpool and its castle were held by parliamentarians, but it fell to the royalist armies of Prince Rupert in 1644, during a major siege that cost the prince as many as 1,500 men. But later that same year, a parliamentarian siege of Liverpool saw the castle switch hands once again, remaining in their control until the end of the war. But when the monarchy returned with King Charles II in 1660, he ordered the mostly ruined castle's demolition on account of its role in the Civil War. Progress on its demolition was slow, and it wasn't until 1726 that the last traces of Liverpool Castle were removed, forever lost to history. Ultimately, practicality was a major cause of the castle's eventual removal, as with the rise of its port and the growth of both the slave trade and commodity imports and exports, Liverpool began to reshape itself as a modern city in the 18th century. At the end of Castle Street here, we can see Liverpool Town Hall, one of the city's oldest landmarks, which was originally built in 1754. Though heavily restored and redeveloped in the 19th century, the Town Hall was a grand symbol of Liverpool's newfound prominence in the Georgian era, built on a magnificent scale with ornate, elegant meeting rooms and decorations befitting a wealthy modern city for its time. One of Liverpool's most spectacular buildings, the Town Hall that we see today is actually the third to have stood there at the end of the road. The first Town Hall was simply a modestly sized building with a thatched roof, built in the 16th century, before being replaced about 100 years later by a stone building, albeit on a much smaller scale than the building of today. And the changing grandeur of Liverpool's town halls is a great example of how what is today one of Britain's great cities was for many years a fairly small town. Now, the area where Liverpool exists today has certainly been inhabited for centuries, even millennia, although the local landscape made extensive settlement difficult, as we can learn from Liverpool's own name. The city's name most likely derives from the Old English words Lifer, meaning thick or muddy water, and Pool, meaning a creek or a pool, likely the one down by the River Mersey, around which the port grew. That place name first emerged in the late 12th century, and it's generally accepted that the town of Liverpool was founded in the year 1207, with King John aiming to establish a port. Now, while a castle was built and the port did develop in the 13th century, Liverpool remained a fairly small and unimportant place, with no more than 1,000 people living here in the late medieval era. Contrast that with the fact that, by the year 1800, there were nearly 80,000 people living in Liverpool, and by 1900, that number had skyrocketed to almost 700,000. The industrial era was a time of immense progress for the once small town of Liverpool, with almost all traces of its medieval past paved over by grand new buildings that symbolised its immense wealth and importance at the heart of Britain's global maritime empire. Later on in our walk, we'll talk more about the good and bad of Liverpool's rise to economic prominence. But nowadays, the city is arguably more well known around the world for its pop culture than its maritime heritage. And that brings us on to what is for many visitors to Liverpool the absolute must-see of the city, the Cavern Quarter, where the Beatles and so many more famous acts made their names in a period of flourishing cultural development centred around Liverpool in the 1960s. The centre of Liverpool's world-famous musical heritage is all focused around one very small back street, Mathew Street. Interestingly, Mathew Street here was once the site of Liverpool's wholesale fruit and vegetable market, but today it's the heart of both tourism and nightlife in the city. Here we can see a statue of John Lennon leaning on the Wall of Fame, which features the names of many music acts which played at the original Cavern Club, as well as other Liverpool artists who reached number 1 in the UK charts. Famously, acts from Liverpool have produced more number 1 singles than any other city in the entire world, and many started out right here on this street. From Jerry and the Pacemakers to Cilla Black, the Searchers, the Mersey Beats, and of course the Beatles, Mathew Street was the epicentre of what became a Liverpudlian takeover of British pop, and subsequently, worldwide music. And while Mathew Street has been full of famous venues through the years, it's the Cavern Club which serves as the place of pilgrimage for music fans from all around the world. Originally, the Cavern Club opened in 1957 as a jazz club. The Beatles, a rock band, played their first gig at the Cavern Club in 1961, when they were given a lunchtime slot as the jazz club was experimenting with allowing rock and roll acts to perform. But at that time, the Cavern Club was actually located a couple of doors down from where the entrance is today, just to our left out of shot. The current new Cavern Club was opened in 1984, and it occupies roughly 70% of the site of the original club of the 1960s. But many people assert that the original venue where the Beatles played was actually located on the other side of Mathew Street. The reason for this misunderstanding is that, since it first opened, the Cavern Club has actually occupied 3 different sites. After the Beatles played their last gig at the original Cavern Club in 1963, the venue struggled financially, briefly closing in 1966 due to bankruptcy. Later on in 1973, the original Cavern Club was forced to close its doors for the last time, to make way for a ventilation shaft for an underground railway. The owners relocated across the street to a bigger venue, roughly where the reopened Eric's is today. However, that new Cavern Club struggled to take off, and it closed down after just 3 years in 1976. But after the opening of the current Cavern Club in 1984, which was achieved by using many bricks that had been saved from the original club of the 1960s, Mathew Street firmly staked its claim as the beating heart of nightlife in Liverpool. Nowadays, Mathew Street is often busy with tourists during the day, taking snaps of the Cavern Club, the John Lennon statue, as well as a statue of Cilla Black that's usually there but not today for some reason. While at night, this part of the city is often packed with locals, students and visitors seeking to soak up the atmosphere, as pubs and clubs blast tunes out of their speakers at full volume, with the sounds reverberating strongly off the walls of these narrow streets. In the wall of this pub at the end of Mathew Street, we can see a bust of one Carl Gustav Jung, a psychiatrist who proclaimed the famous phrase in reference to this city, "Liverpool is the pool of life. It makes to live." It's often thought that Jung said this after a visit to a thriving Liverpool in the 1920s, although Jung said it was actually after a dream in which he visited the city that he wrote that famous quote. Coming to the end of Mathew Street now, this part of Liverpool is full of things to do, whether you're looking for Beatles heritage or if you fancy a good night out on the town. But as we mentioned, before this area became the beating heart of pop culture and nightlife in Liverpool, it was the site of the city's wholesale fruit and vegetable market. Now, while these streets certainly aren't medieval in origin, they were once a smoky collection of alleyways lined with warehouses. Today though, small lanes like Rainford Gardens here are home to historic pubs like the White Star, one of the longest running pubs in Liverpool. Dating from the 1880s, the pub of course takes its name from White Star Line of Titanic fame, and it's actually recognised as the place where the Beatles played their very first gig, and also where, after later performances at the Cavern Club, they would come to receive their payment. Interestingly, the Beatles' very first gig at the Cavern Club in that lunchtime of 1961 earned them a solid £5, equivalent to just over £100 today, although George Harrison nearly wasn't paid at all, because he was wearing jeans, and so was nearly not let into the club for breaking its dress code. Over the course of their 292 appearances at the Cavern Club, the Beatles' fame inevitably went into the stratosphere, and by the time of their final gig in 1963, they earned a huge performance fee of £300, more than £6,000 in today's money. And that kind of money would do you very well on the many shopping streets of Liverpool today. Having emerged from the narrow Cavern Quarter, we now find ourselves on Whitechapel, an enormous wide shopping street that makes up one of the main retail parades in modern Liverpool. Originally, Whitechapel was named after a nearby chapel, which we can probably deduce was white. But before it was a huge boulevard, the street was known as Frog Lane, after a colony of frogs living in what was a marshy, squalid area that formed part of the bed of the pool, the inlet from the River Mersey. In fact, while we now find ourselves at the crossroads of Liverpool's four main shopping streets, Whitechapel, Lord Street, Church Street and Paradise Street, just over 300 years ago, we'd have been knee-deep in mud standing here. But as Liverpool's wealth and population grew during the 18th century, the bed of the muddy pool was paved over by these streets, which now form the heart of the modern city's main retail district. Now, although the muddy pool wasn't the most attractive area of Liverpool, it was an integral part of the city, much like these major shopping streets today. The pool began life as a small haven for ships tackling the rough waves at the end of the River Mersey, while for many years during times of war, it was also a useful place for merchant vessels to hide, so as to avoid detection and potential conflict with any enemy ships out in the Irish Sea. But after Liverpool's modern port infrastructure was developed throughout the 18th century, the naturally created pool lost its importance, meaning that it could be paved over by these streets. Here, we're walking down Paradise Street, which up until the 1720s was known as Common Shore, or Shoreditch after the pool. Nowadays, however, this major city street is lined with huge modern shops, part of the groundbreaking Liverpool One development that completely reshaped the city centre. For many years, Paradise Street here was home to an enormous car park, a bus station, a large hotel and an array of other shops. But in the early to mid-2000s, it and a number of other central Liverpool streets were transformed into the brand new Liverpool One, a huge open-air shopping centre that dominates the city centre today. Opened in 2008, Liverpool One is the 9th largest shopping centre in the UK, and it's fair to say that its development has created a particularly sleek modern environment in the heart of Liverpool, complete with 169 shops, a massive cinema, apartments, and many more facilities that draw in thousands of people every day. Paradise Street is the main open-air shopping street in Liverpool 1, but many side streets have also been heavily redeveloped with the mall's strikingly modern design. One interesting fact about Liverpool 1 is that, to avoid creating an overly homogeneous and boring retail heart for the city, the project made it so that each building was overseen by a different architect, creating a varied landscape of shops that's far more interesting to walk among. We'll return to Paradise Street and Liverpool 1 later on in our walk, but for now we're walking up College Lane, which will take us out of the very centre of the city towards one of Liverpool's hippest neighbourhoods. That would be the area known as Ropewalks, where we'll find not only an array of independent shops and cafes, but also the remains of a church bombed to near destruction in the Second World War, and Liverpool's own Chinatown, home to the oldest Chinese community in all of Europe. Passing by a pair of industrial-era warehouses, Liverpool is today a city of many different faces, not only home to a varied collection of architecture, but a particularly diverse population. Owing to its existence as a port city for so many years, Liverpool has long been a major place of settlement and migration for people from all over the world. Famously, Liverpool is known for having the strongest Irish heritage of any city in England, and as many as 50% of people in Liverpool today can claim to have Irish heritage. Located directly across the Irish Sea from Dublin, Liverpool has always been easy to reach for people from the Emerald Isle. But it was in the 1840s that a particularly large wave of Irish migration came about, as people fled the infamous potato famine. During its time as a small port town, Liverpool had already spent centuries trading extensively with Ireland, but as a result of the famine-induced influx of the 1840s, Irish people went on to make up over 20% of Liverpool's population in the mid-19th century, and it's fair to say that their influence on the city has been especially far-reaching since then. You'll know that the people of Liverpool are nicknamed Scousers, notable for their distinctive Scouse accent. But around 150 years ago, there was no such thing as a distinctive Scouse accent, as Liverpudlians typically spoke with a more generic Lancashire accent, having been historically located on the edge of that county. However, it was the influx of Irish in the mid-19th century, along with influence from Welsh and even mainland European immigrants, that caused the development of an accent unique to the rest of Lancashire, that being the Scouse accent that we know and love today. As for where the nickname Scouser comes from, that's derived from the name of a stew that was commonly eaten by sailors here, named lobscouse. Lobscouse was heavily influenced by the ingredients of traditional Irish stews, incorporating potatoes and beef along with vegetables. But it's typically thought that lobscouse was actually brought to this part of the world by Scandinavian sailors, with the name lobscouse related to a similar stew eaten in Norway, known as lopskaus. Liverpool's illustrious Irish links are just one part of its fantastically diverse cultural heritage. And when we make our way up to Chinatown, we'll talk about Liverpool's Chinese community, as well as the city's historic black community, the oldest black community in Britain today. Here though, we're looking at the striking glass entrance to the Clayton Square shopping centre, and behind it the iconic Radio City Tower, otherwise known as St John's Beacon, which is the second tallest building in Liverpool today. Later on in our walk, we'll get a closer look at the tower that's come to form an instantly recognisable part of Liverpool's modern skyline. But we're now making our way into the Ropewalks district by way of the gently sloping Bold Street. At the foot of the street here, we're passing by the Lyceum, a marvellous building of 1802, which, when it was built, was the very first subscription library to open in Britain, before later going into use as a gentleman's club, a post office, a bank, and a restaurant, although it's currently unoccupied today. But the Lyceum, for all its ups and downs through the last 200 years, is emblematic of the Ropewalks district of Liverpool, which has evolved dramatically over the last couple of centuries. Made up of a group of straight roads that slope in parallel down the hill here, Ropewalks takes its name from the craft of rope making for sailing ships. Historically, before the mechanisation of rope manufacture, workers would lay ropes out lengthways on the ground here as they put them together. And that's why the streets of Ropewalks were built to be so straight, so that long ropes that would be put onto huge sailing ships could be laid out flat for manufacturers to work on them. The street layout gives this area of Liverpool a particularly distinctive atmosphere, compared with the wide open shopping streets we've explored in the very heart of the city. But rope making didn't last forever in this area of town. Historically, this was one of the busiest zones of industry in 18th century Liverpool, after the city's first dock, and the world's first commercial dock, was built nearby. But the focus of industrial development in Liverpool moved further away from this area in the 19th century. As a result, during that time, Ropewalks here became the home of a mix of both residential and commercial properties, with many merchants living on the likes of Bold Street here, in houses that were connected to their own small warehouses. And today in the 21st century, Ropewalks has come to serve a similar purpose to during the height of the industrial era, albeit now as a blend of residential houses and flats, and many of Liverpool's independent businesses. Bold Street is the principal street of the Ropewalks area, and during the day it's a rather pleasant pedestrian street lined with quirky independent shops and quaint cafes with outdoor seating that offer something a little different to many of the main big brands you'll find in the very centre of the city. A walk up Bold Street is also well worth it just for the view of St Luke's Church at the top, which we'll talk more about in a minute or two. But when the sun goes down, this part of Liverpool emerges as another hub of action-packed nightlife. Albeit not quite as raucous as many of the pubs and clubs you'll find around Mathew Street, Bold Street and the rest of Ropewalks is home to an array of bars and clubs housed in a variety of unusual venues, from former warehouses to rooftops and outdoor gardens, many of which are open through the night to cater to the thousands of punters looking to enjoy themselves in the busy city of Liverpool. In the Ropewalks area in particular, much of the nighttime crowd is made up by Liverpool's lively student population, around 70,000 of whom attend the city's 3 universities, and a range of different colleges. The largest of the universities is the University of Liverpool, established in 1881. Much of the campus of the University of Liverpool is located in the city's Knowledge Quarter, which we won't quite have time to visit today. But if you have the time, a stroll around the campus offers the chance to see even more spectacular buildings amid a lively student environment. But speaking of spectacular buildings, we're now coming to the top of Bold Street, where we can see the iconic St Luke's Church, or as it's better known, the Bombed Out Church. Built in the early 19th century, St Luke's served as a brand new parish church to cater to the rapidly ballooning city of Liverpool, but it only lasted for just over 100 years. That's because during the Liverpool Blitz in May of 1941, the church was hit by a bomb dropped by the Luftwaffe, causing a major fire that destroyed all of the church's interior and its roof. This left just the burnt-out shell of the church, but instead of being demolished, the damaged church was retained as a memorial to the people of Liverpool who died in the Second World War, and it came to gain the nickname the Bombed Out Church. Nowadays, as well as serving as a memorial, the Bombed Out Church is often used as a cultural venue, hosting music performances, art shows and outdoor cinema screenings, while there's sometimes a cafe that operates in its grounds, adding to the appeal of what has become a favourite landmark of the people of Liverpool. We'll get a better look at the burnt-out shell of St Luke's in a short while when we pass back by here. But the bombed-out church isn't the only distinctive landmark in the Ropewalks area. Ropewalks is also home to Liverpool's own Chinatown, one of the most famous in Europe. The entrance to Chinatown proper is marked here by a grand dragon statue, and the enclave is based mostly around the three streets of Nelson Street, Duke Street and Berry Street here. Now today, Liverpool's Chinatown is one of 5 you'll find in England, alongside London, Manchester, Birmingham and Newcastle. But this Chinatown is the oldest not only in the country, but in all of Europe. As a city that became a real melting pot of cultures and ethnicities in the 19th century, Liverpool saw an influx of Chinese immigrants long before many other cities in the country. In the 1850s, a new shipping line was being established linking Liverpool with the cities of Shanghai and Hong Kong, and the ships were operated by many Chinese seamen. To accommodate the men while they were on shore leave here in Liverpool, the shipping line opened a number of boarding houses where they could stay with their fellow countrymen, but many decided to stay on in Liverpool permanently. At that time, Liverpool's Chinese community was concentrated down by the old docks, and over time, many people began opening their own Chinese shops and restaurants, which created a home away from home for many more Chinese settlers. Fast forward to the Second World War, and the Chinese area around the docks found itself a victim of heavy bombing during the Blitz. So after the war, Liverpool's Chinatown was re-established further inland, right here. Crucially, during the war, many of the Chinese sailors on shore leave in Liverpool were recruited by the British Merchant Navy to assist in the war effort, and many of the 20,000 Chinese sailors who joined up played a pivotal role in Britain's manoeuvres in the Atlantic during the war, although many were killed by German submarine attacks. Even still, it was intended that Chinese sailors on shore leave here would eventually return to China, but due to the war with Japan in Asia at the time, many more stayed here for good, and hundreds of families in the Liverpool area today can trace their heritage back to those men. Liverpool's Chinatown is a particularly authentic cultural enclave, and although it's admittedly not quite as lavish as the one you'll find down in London, it is home to one of the most striking Chinese arches in the world. Here at the top of Nelson Street, we find the symbol of Liverpool's Chinatown, a beautiful archway known as a Paifang. This Paifang dates from the year 2000, and it's the largest gateway of its kind you'll find anywhere outside of China, having been imported to Liverpool piece by piece from Shanghai, and then constructed with a wonderful eye for detail. The characters at the top of the Paifang simply read Chinatown, and the gateway is said to hold a spiritual function of warding off evil, bringing good luck and fortune to the area, as well as many tourists who come to take a picture of it too. Now though, we'll make our way away from Liverpool's Chinatown, and take a short walk up the hill towards one of the tallest and most imposing buildings in the city, the immense Liverpool Cathedral. But before we get there, we mentioned earlier that Liverpool isn't just home to the oldest Chinese community in the UK, but also the country's oldest black community. The origins of Liverpool's black community date back to the 1730s, during the earlier stages of the port's rise to prominence in the British Empire. Initially, many black settlers in Liverpool were sailors, or people coming to Britain for work or education, but a large number arrived after having been brought here as part of the brutal transatlantic slave trade. But initially, it was through the port of Bristol that the vast majority of slave trading between Africa, Britain and the Americas took place. However, with the development of its docks by the wealthy Liverpool Corporation, Liverpool came to overtake Bristol as Britain's preeminent slave trading port around the 1740s, eventually going on to handle over 80% of all slave ships in the country, as we mentioned earlier. Liverpool's slave traders bought thousands upon thousands of people from West Africa to be sold into a brutal life of slavery. But from the year 1772 onwards, a court ruling deemed that slaves in England could no longer be forcibly removed from the country and sold off overseas. This meant many Africans were fortunately able to escape slavery and live a relatively freer life in Britain. And as this port was where they had initially been brought, it was the place where many would put down permanent roots. Over time, Liverpool's black community continued to grow, with a wider influx of black sailors, soldiers, and people of many other backgrounds arriving from around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, creating the true melting pot of cultures that Liverpool became. And up here, we find a grand symbol of just one part of Liverpool's diverse religious profile, the behemoth that is Liverpool Cathedral, which has dominated the city's skyline for decades. One of two cathedrals in the city, the other being the striking Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral about half a mile away, this Anglican cathedral was built over a 74-year period, from 1904 to 1978, on top of St James's Mount here. As well as serving as a marvellous symbol of the city today, Liverpool Cathedral is a titan of global religious buildings, ranking among the largest in the world. Covering an area of nearly 10,000 square metres, or 105,000 square feet, Liverpool Cathedral is the biggest cathedral in Britain by some margin, and the 5th largest cathedral on the entire planet. Nowadays, you can even take tours up to the top of its immense 100-metre high tower, which offers some incredible views across Liverpool and the wider Merseyside area. And while you're up there, you can also get a glimpse of Great George and the rest of the cathedral's famous bells, which are the heaviest and highest in the whole world. We could go on and on about the many earth-shattering statistics and records that Liverpool Cathedral lays claim to, but the area in which it was built is also rather interesting too. This raised area of land overlooking the pool and the modern city centre is known as St James's Mount, and for many years it served as a major cemetery in Liverpool. But before this area was a cemetery, it actually began life as a quarry, with the exposed stone that we can see down below used to build the walls of Liverpool's docks in the 18th century, and the ornate town hall that we passed by earlier. Here, meanwhile, we're passing by a building known as the Oratory, built in 1829, long before the cathedral as the chapel for the surrounding cemetery, and which was designed in a rather impressive fashion to look much like an ancient Greek temple. Nowadays, the Oratory is used as a bit of extra space for Liverpool's famous Walker Art Gallery, containing sculptures and a range of historic funeral-themed monuments and artworks. Of the Anglican cathedral that towers above the Oratory, meanwhile, it's fair to say that this immense building is a real showstopper among Liverpool landmarks. However, as we mentioned, Liverpool Cathedral isn't the only cathedral in town, and it's certainly not the only one with a spectacular design. Over in the city's Knowledge Quarter, you'll find this eye-catching modern building, Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, which caters to the city's significant population of Catholics. The influx of Irish immigrants in the 1840s brought about a surge in Liverpool's Catholic population, and so it eventually became apparent that the city would need a Catholic cathedral. Eventually, after various plans failed to get off the ground, the TP-inspired Metropolitan Cathedral was opened in 1967, and its distinctive exterior and links with the city's Irish population has led it to gain the local nickname Paddy's Wigwam. Now sadly, we won't quite have time to go and see Paddy's Wigwam up close, but here we find ourselves in one of the most splendid areas of central Liverpool, the Georgian Quarter. This is Rodney Street, which was laid out in 1784, and is lined with an array of gorgeous terraced Georgian-era houses. But it's not just the architecture that Rodney Street is famous for, as this road has gained a long-standing reputation as a place where many medical professionals have worked. Historically, Rodney Street was the home of many private doctors' practices, and that helped the street to gain the label of the Harley Street of the North, comparable to the street in London, also famed for its private doctors. Passing by a street post topped with a liver bird, the legend of which we'll talk more about in a moment, Rodney Street has yet another claim to fame on top of its beautiful buildings and medical credentials. When it was first laid out, Rodney Street became one of the many places where the affluent merchants and elites moved into, as they aimed to remain at a distance from what had become a packed city centre and a hardy riverside dock development. As such, over the course of the 19th century, this area of town became the home of many wealthy families who had made their fortune in a variety of industries, unfortunately including the slave trade. One such family was the Gladstone family, headed by one John Gladstone, who owned more slaves across plantations in Jamaica and Guyana than anybody else in Britain at the time of the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. With his fortune, however, he applied for a brand new house on Rodney Street, and that was number 62 here, where his son, William Ewart Gladstone, was born in 1809. Of course, William Gladstone would go on to serve as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for over 12 years. Now initially, with his father John holding a degree of influence in British politics, William Gladstone didn't support the rapid progress that was being made towards the abolition of slavery, instead favouring what he called a more gradual emancipation. But over time, as his own political career developed, Gladstone began to turn against his father, and began supporting policies that backed companies around the world which refused to use slave labour, ultimately asserting that he and his family had been wrong on the matter of slavery in the past. Later on in his career, Gladstone was elected to the office of Prime Minister on 4 separate occasions, a record that holds to this day, and he even served as PM until the age of 84, making him the oldest Prime Minister in British history. Having firmly moved away from the slave-owning legacy of his family, Gladstone proved a hugely popular politician among Britain's working classes, and is today recognised as one of the country's greatest leaders. We're now coming to the end of this part of Rodney Street, but it continues on over the road in front of us, and it was in that section of Rodney Street in 1934 that another famous Liverpool name was born: Brian Epstein, the renowned manager of the Beatles. In the 1950s, Epstein worked in and was eventually put in charge of his family's highly successful music shop on Great Charlotte Street in the city centre. But after hearing words of a certain band by the name of the Beatles, he made his way over to the Cavern Club to watch them perform. Epstein was struck immediately by the Beatles' groundbreaking talent, and after religiously going to see them perform at the Cavern Club for 3 weeks, he proposed the idea of managing their band, a deal which went through in early 1962. And the rest, as they say, is history, as Epstein, managing his first band, sought to clean up the Beatles' image a little, exchanging their so-called scruffy aesthetic of blue jeans and leather jackets for neat jumpers, and then eventually their iconic clean-cut suits. Now making our way back down the hill along Leece Street, we're again passing by the famous bombed-out church, and from this side we can see more clearly how the former place of worship has been left as a burnt-out shell. Of course, the bombed-out church has been left in this ruined state as a memorial to those who died in the war, and in the church gardens there's also this wonderful new statue depicting the Christmas truce of World War I, a further symbol of the history of conflict. The statue was originally meant to be permanently moved to Belgium after it was unveiled in 2014, but it remains as part of the wonderfully regenerated church gardens, complete with that outdoor cafe that we mentioned earlier. Altogether, this has really helped to reinvigorate the bombed-out church as a real attraction of Liverpool and the Ropewalks area, after it had fallen into relative disrepair just over 10 years ago. Now at the bottom of Leece Street, we're going to take a walk across the edge of central Liverpool along the major Renshaw Street, which will lead us towards the busy area surrounding Liverpool Lime Street Station, the city's main railway station, and where we'll also be able to get a glimpse of some of the city's most impressive buildings. We'll get there in just over 5 minutes' time, but on our way we'll pass by many more intriguing and often overlooked landmarks of the city centre, each with their own stories to tell. But before we get into that, a couple of minutes ago on Rodney Street, we saw a street post that was topped with a statue of a liver bird, the symbol of Liverpool, which, as we spotted at the start of our walk, stands proudly atop the Liver building on the waterfront. The liver bird has been a symbol of Liverpool as far back as the mid-13th century, when it first appeared on the seal of the medieval town. Now, while liver birds are entirely mythical creatures, there's some debate as to exactly which bird its design is based on. Originally, the liver bird is thought to have been meant to represent an eagle, but the drawing on the medieval town seal was apparently so bad that people over time forgot what bird it was meant to be, eventually coming to recognise the liver bird as a mythical form of a cormorant, as it is today. You'll find representations of the liver bird all over Liverpool, not only in the form of statues like the two atop the Liver building, which are actually chained down so that they don't fly away, but also on the crests of Liverpool's two most historic football clubs. That's right, while the liver bird appears prominently on the Liverpool FC crest today, and has done since 1901, until the 1930s, it also stood at the centre of the crest of Everton FC, before being replaced by the iconic Everton lockup. As such, many say that, while it's most evident on the Liverpool badge, the liver bird belongs to both clubs, as a symbol of the great city of Liverpool as a whole. I'm sure many Reds and Toffees fans might dispute that one way or the other, and we'll get into the fascinating tale of the two clubs' illustrious history and intense rivalry a little later on in our walk. Now, while Renshaw Street here developed mostly during Liverpool's period of rapid industrialisation in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this major thoroughfare is also home to a number of intriguing cultural institutions, including Liverpool's Grand Central Hall just beside us here. Dating back to 1905, the Grand Central Hall actually began its life as the central meeting hall for Liverpool's Methodist religious community, built in an especially grand stature. But for most of its life, it was used primarily for entertainment purposes, serving as the home of the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra and a huge cinema during the 20th century. In recent years, the building, though much unchanged outside, has been sold off by its original Methodist owners, and it's come to have a number of different uses, including a makeshift market hall, a theatre, and today a complex that includes a luxury hotel, deluxe restaurants, and a performance space for concerts, plays, and film screenings, with the venue claiming to host the largest video screen in the country outside of London's Wembley Stadium. A little further along Renshaw Street from the Grand Central Hall, and we can see what was once one of the most important buildings in British shopping during the 20th century, the flagship store of the nationwide department store chain, Lewis's. Although this building was built in the 1950s, Lewis's started out its life in 1856 here in Liverpool, initially opened by one David Lewis as a men's and boys' clothing store, and it grew to become one of Britain's most famous chains, with outlets in the centres of most major cities. Sadly, most of its shops were closed in the 1990s, and the Liverpool store here was eventually shut down in 2010, bringing an end to over 150 years of retail for Lewis's in the city of its birth. Here, meanwhile, we're looking up at the Britannia Adelphi Hotel, which was built in 1914 and which has played host to many important guests visiting Liverpool, such as Winston Churchill, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and many performers including Frank Sinatra, Bob Dylan, and Laurel and Hardy, who were all appearing at the nearby Empire Theatre. Now, looking across the city past the old Lewis's department store, we can see the famous Radio City Tower, which, as we mentioned, is the second tallest building in Liverpool today, and began life with the name St John's Beacon after it was built in 1969. When the beacon was first built, it featured a luxury revolving restaurant at the top, such was the fad in those days, but it eventually closed during the 1980s, with the tower left empty for many years as it loomed over Liverpool. But in 1999, it became the home of the local radio station, Radio City 96.7, who refurbished it as their offices and studios, and in 2010, a viewing gallery was reopened to allow the public to visit the top of the tower once again, bringing this famous landmark of Liverpool's skyline back into the city's life. As we pass by the historic Vines pub, built in 1907 as one of a number of deluxe ale houses in the city centre during its time of great industrial prosperity, we'll get a few more glimpses of Liverpool's iconic Radio City Tower as we continue our walk through the heart of the city. For now though, we're going to make our way along Lime Street here, which will lead us towards Liverpool's central train station, and a busy area of the city home to some particularly imposing landmarks, and further long-running regeneration work too. Now, as we discussed earlier when we were walking through the area occupied by the Liverpool One development, Liverpool city centre has changed rather significantly in recent decades, and while the retail core of the city is now a sleek, spacious development, areas like Lime Street here are still undergoing modernisation work, both to make use of its buildings and all the spaces they stand on, as well as to free up these easily congested roads a little. This part of the city, though always busy with people particularly travelling to and from Lime Street Station, has been packed with roadworks for the best part of 2 years now, although after a number of delays, it's said that they'll come to an end in the summer of 2022, making the area around the station that little bit more open. As we take in another view of the Radio City Tower as it soars above the buildings of St John's Shopping Centre, we now find ourselves in the part of the city that's dominated by Liverpool's main railway station, Lime Street, which of course takes its name from the street we're walking along here. Typically the gateway to Liverpool city centre from elsewhere in the UK, there has been a station here on Lime Street since at least 1836, when it was opened as a terminus of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity railway. Back then, Liverpool Lime Street Station looked much different than it does today, but as a pioneering station at the end of a then groundbreaking railway line, it proved a huge success with the people of both Liverpool and Manchester, so much so that the station had to be expanded significantly within 6 years of its opening. Over the decades, Lime Street Station only continued to grow and grow to accommodate the rising number of travellers passing through it, with the line all the way up from London added later on in the 19th century. Nowadays, having been beautifully remodelled and modernised, Lime Street is the largest station in Liverpool, with 11 platforms into which trains arrive from as far away as London, Glasgow, Norwich, and many more cities in the country, while the station is also connected to the city's Merseyrail network underground, which allows easy access between the rest of Merseyside and Liverpool city centre. Now, as we've mentioned, this part of the city centre may still be busy with roadworks, but on walking out of Lime Street, it's difficult not to be struck by the many grand buildings that stand around you. Opposite the station here, we're walking towards St George's Hall, one of Liverpool's most famous and most spectacular buildings of all. Built back in 1854, St George's Hall came to stand as perhaps the most striking symbol of the city, of Liverpool's newfound significance as one of the world's most important cities, with the building designed as a magnificent events venue that includes vast ornate halls and rooms inside. Over the years, St George's Hall has played host to countless famous events in the city of Liverpool, early on in its history regularly hosting the author Charles Dickens for his readings, and later on commemorative events for the deaths of John Lennon, George Harrison, and the Hillsborough disaster of 1989, as well as huge concerts, including one in 2008, where Ringo Starr played on the roof of the building to a crowd of over 50,000 people down below. Fronted by statues of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria on horseback, St George's Hall also stands opposite the historic North Western Hotel, built in 1871 for the London and North Western Railway, which, as the name suggests, linked London with England's northwest, and major cities like Liverpool here. Now, as we make our way back through the roadworks around Lime Street and St George's Hall, we're now going to walk all the way back through the heart of Liverpool towards the Albert Dock and the waterfront where we started our walk nearly an hour ago. There, we'll come to the end of our walk around this great city, but there's still much more to see and discover about Liverpool's illustrious history. And of course, while the city is famed for its musical, commercial and architectural heritage as we've discussed so far, we absolutely can't forget Liverpool's incredible sporting legacy, most notably in the field of football. As we mentioned earlier, Liverpool is home to two of England's most successful and most historic football clubs, Liverpool FC and Everton FC, who play their matches on the outskirts of the city centre at Anfield and Goodison Park respectively, two stadiums which are actually separated by less than half a mile across the suburban Stanley Park. Now both Liverpool and Everton are among the oldest football clubs in England, and the matches they play against one another, known as the Merseyside Derby, is the longest running top-flight derby in the country. But of the two, Everton is the older club, founded over 140 years ago in 1878, and having starred as one of the 12 founding members of England's Football League in 1888. At the time of the first season of the Football League, Everton actually played their home matches at Anfield, although they moved out in 1892, and Liverpool FC, who took over the ground, were born. For the majority of their more than 100 years of history, both Everton and Liverpool have been right at the top of the English game. Everton have won the English League title 9 times in their history, and most notably are one of the longest serving clubs in the top flight of English football. Everton have only missed 4 seasons of the First Division, and they haven't been relegated since 1955, although they managed a dramatic near escape from a historic drop in 2022. Liverpool, meanwhile, have been in the First Division of English football since 1962, and have proved to be one of the most successful clubs in the history of the game, having won 19 league titles through their history, second only to their longtime rivals Manchester United, and also having achieved regular international success too, with 6 European Cup victories, the most of any English club by far. All in all, Liverpool's football clubs are one of the most famous and widely known exports of the city around the world, with Liverpool FC in particular starring as one of the world's most widely supported football teams. If you're in Liverpool and have the time, I'd thoroughly recommend a visit to the two clubs' stadiums, just a short walk away from one another, particularly as Everton are now set to move out of their historic home at Goodison Park towards a new stadium on the site of a former dock in 2024. Moving away from the history of football in Liverpool for now then, we find ourselves back in the busy retail heart of the city. Here, we find ourselves on Elliott Street, running between the Clayton Square Shopping Centre, opened in 1989, and the St John's Shopping Centre, the largest covered shopping centre in the city, which opened back in 1969. As we spoke about earlier on, Liverpool is very much a city where you can shop until you drop. But before the modern shopping centres that occupy the streets here today, this place was still busy with commerce, albeit related to local markets. We've mentioned a number of different areas around the city which were home to different trades and markets, but St John's Shopping Centre takes its name from a former grand market hall that stood on this street, known as St John's Market, which existed between 1822 and 1964. Sadly lost to history now, the market hall was designed to be a modern, capacious new home for Liverpool's historic street market, which used to take place around the Victoria Monument and the site of Liverpool Castle that we passed by earlier, but which began to far outgrow the space on the streets around that part of the city. With the creation of a purpose-built market hall here, not only were Liverpool's streets freed up from the many trade stalls that were clogging them up in the early 19th century, but also it drew more people into this area of the city that was once known more commonly as the site of the Pool. And with all the regeneration and pedestrianisation that has taken place on these streets over the last 200 years or so, this remains the bustling core of shopping in Liverpool, with Church Street serving as one of those 4 main shopping streets lined with immense buildings. Now Church Street, as well as playing host to many of the biggest department stores in the city today, is an interesting enigma of a street, owing to the fact that, despite its name, there's no church anywhere near it. So where did Church Street get its name from? Well, as you'd expect, there was once a church that stood at the end of Church Street, and roughly where the entrance to the Liverpool One shopping centre is today. The church, known as St Peter's, was originally built in 1704, and it served as the main church in Liverpool for over 200 years. And after the city was awarded city status by Queen Victoria in 1880, The parish church at the end of the street became a kind of proto-cathedral, where the new Bishop of Liverpool would take his seat. In 1919, however, with the local church needing money and the Liverpool Corporation developing the city centre like wildfire, St Peter's valuable city centre land was sold off, and it was demolished in 1922, replaced by a large branch of Woolworths. Of course, Liverpool Cathedral was then built on St James's Mount to replace the old parish church, but the lost place of worship in the very centre of Liverpool is the reason why the wide open Church Street and this small street known as Church Alley have their names. Church Alley also gives us the best view of what is one of the most often overlooked landmarks in the centre of Liverpool, but which is actually the oldest building in the city centre, dating from a time when the pool was as yet undeveloped and St Peter's Church had only just been built. Built 305 years ago in 1717, this is the Bluecoat, which started out its life as a charity school for the poor children of Liverpool, and was expanded over its first few years to become the home of a boarding school known as the Liverpool Bluecoat School. This building served as the home of the Bluecoat School for nearly 200 years, but the school moved away to a new site in the outer city area of Wavertree, where the school remains to this day. The building here in the centre of Liverpool was threatened with demolition when the school moved out, but it was saved after a public campaign and made the home of an independent art school and art society, and the building to this day remains in use as an arts centre, said to be the oldest of its kind in Britain. The presence of the Bluecoat also gave birth to the name for this narrow street, School Lane, which is much changed since the Bluecoat was first built. Of course, as well as redevelopment in Liverpool, the city was heavily impacted by the Liverpool Blitz of 1941, which destroyed countless buildings on streets like School Lane here, as you can see from this image of post-air raid damage, while many major landmarks like the Customs House, or the so-called Fourth Grace of Liverpool, and famously the bombed-out church, also fell victim to the Luftwaffe's bombs. The Bluecoat too was heavily damaged during the Blitz after bombs hit the building on 2 consecutive nights in May of 1941, but the building was thankfully repaired and restored in 1951, still retaining its title as the oldest landmark in the centre of Liverpool. And as we walk through the covered and rather lovely checkered St Peter's Lane here, the presence of 18th, 19th, 20th and 21st century buildings in Liverpool city centre, along with the varied architecture of the Liverpool One development, means there's always something new to discover around each corner here. Of course, within the many towering buildings of Liverpool city centre, there's countless history to be discovered too, even when related to the darker sides of the city's heritage. As we've mentioned, as Britain's premier slave trading port, wealthy slave traders had a major impact on the city, and here we're walking along Manesty's Lane, named after Joseph Manesty, who started out as a local ship owner working in the Mediterranean, but switched to slave trading in 1744. Now, one of the crew on board Manesty's slave trading ships was a man named John Newton, who rose to become a wealthy captain of slave ships himself. However, among the many dark stories of slave traders in the past, John Newton's story is one of surprising redemption and recognition of the evil that was taking place at the time. Newton left the slave trade in 1755, a decision taken a few years after he had experienced a religious epiphany while caught in a storm out at sea on the Atlantic, when he, at the time not particularly religious, called out to God to have mercy on him. Years later, having evolved to become a supporter of the abolition of the slave trade, Newton penned a hymn in memory of this transformative event in his life, in which it's often interpreted that he describes his recognition of his wretchedness for participating in the brutal slave trade. He named the hymn Amazing Grace, and it's the song that you'll almost certainly have heard for yourself, which has come to be known by many as both one of the most iconic hymns in the English-speaking world and a seminal work of anti-slavery music. Having now made our way through the busy shopping heart of Liverpool once again, we're at the bottom of Paradise Street, where we'll find a landmark that marks how Liverpool developed its port further, even after the dismantling of the slave trade. On this city centre junction, We're passing by the Sailors' Home Gates, placed here in 2011, but which once formed the grand entrance to the iconic Liverpool Sailors' Home, a building that stood just a few yards away from 1850 until 1974. The Sailors' Home, as the name suggests, was a home for sailors passing through Liverpool, and it made its name in particular as a place with affordable and safe lodging for sailors, which also provided educational and leisure activities that were intended to entice men away from the more lurid persuasions of the Docklands area a few streets away. Sadly, the Sailors' Home, once upon a time one of the most important and iconic buildings near Liverpool's waterfront, closed down in 1969, and it was demolished in 1974. But the gates that stand on the edge of Liverpool 1 serve as a much appreciated memory of its former presence in the city. And speaking of buildings which once had a domineering presence in this area of the city, to our right was the site of the old Customs House of Liverpool, the spectacular Fourth Grace that we mentioned earlier on, and which was sadly destroyed in part during the Blitz and demolished after the Second World War. Nowadays, the buildings of Canning Place here arguably aren't quite as spectacular as historic landmarks like the Customs House and the Sailors' Home, although the street does today play host to Liverpool's rather expansive bus and coach station, which takes up an entire block of the city for itself, with buses arriving from and departing for destinations around the Merseyside area, as well as from cities further afield around the rest of the country. But as we pass by the rather modern bus station, we're now coming full circle on our walk around Liverpool, as just up ahead we can see the Strand, and beyond it the city's waterfront and the famous Albert Dock. Once upon a time, this part of Liverpool would have been thronging with activity, with sailors passing in and out of the docks to make their way into the lively city centre, and countless large deliveries of goods making their way onto and off ships as part of the port's trade. At its height, the Port of Liverpool was home to the most advanced system of docks in the world, with each dock being interconnected and separated from the tides of the River Mersey, allowing ships to flow in and out 24/7. Since the first dock was built in 1715, there have been 43 docks built in the Port of Liverpool, many now having been filled in or converted for non-commercial activities, while on the northern outskirts of the city you'll find a number of much larger, more modern docks that still handle millions of tons of cargo every year, making Liverpool's port the fourth largest in the UK today. Of all of Liverpool's docks, however, the most famous is almost certainly the Albert Dock, which we'll find nestled in between a number of neighbouring quays and many historic buildings that now serve as the heart of a modern tourist centre in the city. But with Liverpool's port having been home to as many as 43 docks over the centuries, what makes the Albert Dock so special? Well, as we make our way into the Albert Dock zone with the Canning Dock to our right here, the Albert Dock is notable as one of the most important developments in the history of Liverpool's port, and in the wider scope of international maritime trade. The Albert Dock was opened in 1846, at a time when Liverpool was one of the most important players in global shipping, and it was crucially the first dock in Britain to be built using only bricks, iron and stone, and no wood, as had been commonplace for centuries beforehand. Most importantly, this meant that the Albert Dock and its many warehouses were pretty much fireproof, creating a new security for traders to store their goods without any fear of losing them in a blaze. And there were yet more groundbreaking developments in the Albert Dock for its time, including new, faster methods of loading and offloading goods from ships, sleeker systems for the paying of import duties, and high-tech hydraulic cranes which could lift the heaviest of cargoes with ease. All of this made Liverpool, through which 40% of global trade was already passing at the time, an even more attractive port, with all of the ships passing in and out of this dock being directed from this grand building here, the Albert Dock Traffic Office, which dates to 1847. Like many buildings around the dock, the old traffic office was used for many different purposes later on in its life, as a home of the regional Granada television network, and as a part of the city's museums, while the old pump house that we're passing by here is today used as a pub. And the Albert Dock here is probably the very best example of regeneration in the city of Liverpool, having converted this once packed area of industry into a mixed-use development that celebrates its history. The Albert Dock is one of the biggest tourist attractions in Liverpool for good reason, as there's so much to do in an area concentrated on just one of the city's historic quays. As we take in a view across the city of Liverpool from across the Canning Dock, just one of the many major attractions around the Albert Dock is the immense Merseyside Maritime Museum, which originally opened back in 1980 as one of the first major points of regeneration in this area. The museum, as well as detailing the illustrious seafaring heritage of the city, also includes the International Slavery Museum, and features a number of exhibitions on the Titanic, the famous Lusitania ocean liner, and the story of Liverpool's docks and waterfront through the years. Now, while the Albert Dock was once the main arm in the city's thriving maritime trade, the development of global shipping soon meant that this once revolutionary dock couldn't keep up with the times, larger ships and huge containers needing bigger and more modern facilities. As such, the Port of Liverpool built larger, newer docks on the northern edge of the city towards Seaforth, which are still busy with trade today, while the Albert Dock and the rest of the South Docks around here were closed in 1972. Initially, the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board had considered demolishing the Albert Dock, which was silted up as trade came to an end. But it was listed for conservation in 1976, although this didn't mean immediate regeneration. In the early 1980s, the Albert Dock and much of the waterfront was pretty much abandoned and left to ruin, but it was decided that it would be redeveloped as a brand new commercial, residential and leisure complex that would form a new centre of the city's waterfront. Fast forward 40 years, and the Albert Dock, as we can see around us, is an always lively part of Liverpool's waterfront, frequented regularly by tourists who come to visit museums like the Maritime Museum, the Tate Liverpool and the Beatles Story, as well as to peruse the many shops and restaurants that are now housed within the dock's former warehouses. And as we look across the Albert Dock, the warehouses and many more buildings that surround it have all been listed at Grade 1 status, the same level as the likes of Big Ben and Buckingham Palace, making this dock the home of the largest single collection of Grade 1 listed buildings in the UK, as well as having been part of the former UNESCO World Heritage Site that was unfortunately repealed last year. Of course, as well as facilities celebrating the city's maritime heritage, the Albert Dock is home to a mishmash of monuments and landmarks marking every corner of what makes Liverpool so famous, and of course, what tourists want to see when they make their way down here to the city's #1 attraction. On any given day, you'll find people playing music or painting on the cobbled walkways between docks, making the area an atmospheric delight to stroll around at any time of the year. Just here, we're passing by the old Pier Master's house, a small dockside landmark built in 1852 as the family home of Liverpool's Pier Master, who was responsible for the safety of the ships using the docks at high tide. Just outside the Pier Master's house, meanwhile, there stands a statue of a Liverpool icon of the 1960s, Billy Fury, who, despite not being as well known around the world as the Beatles, was in many ways just as successful as them. Initially famed for his Elvis-inspired rock and roll act, Billy Fury wrote and performed 24 hits during his career, the same number as the Beatles, although circumstances conspired that he never quite managed to hit the top of the charts at any point during his 332 weeks on the charts. As we touched on when we were walking down Mathew Street, it's almost impossible to give time to tell the story of all of Liverpool's most famous musical acts, with so many having made such a big impact on the industry during the city's cultural heyday in the mid-20th century. But statues like that of the Beatles, Billy Fury and more to be found around Liverpool are always great to see. Now, here we're walking across a small swing bridge that links the busy Albert Dock with Pier Head, where we began our walk and where we'll be finishing up in a couple of minutes. Pier Head, or as we learned at the start of our video, officially George's Pier Head, extends for a fair distance along Liverpool's famous waterfront, from here beside the Albert Dock, all the way past the Three Graces and towards the Titanic Memorial to the north. Among its wide open spaces, you'll find many monuments on Pier Head, and just here beside the Canning Dock, there's this characterful statue of a horse. Unveiled here in 2010, The statue is titled Waiting, and it depicts one of the many working horses that formed an important part of the busy maritime trade that took place in this part of the city. Before modern developments like large cranes and the railways, horses were crucial for the moving of goods from the port to the rest of the city and further beyond, serving as rather unsung heroes of Liverpool's spectacular economic development during the Industrial Revolution. At the peak of the port's activity, there were more than 20,000 horses working on Liverpool's streets, the highest of any city in Britain behind only London, and so the small monument to them on Pier Head is a more than deserved tribute. With the spectacular new Museum of Liverpool occupying a prominent position at the very centre of Pier Head, along with contemporary buildings like the black offices and galleries we can see in front of us here, and of course the many beautifully preserved historic monuments and buildings that formed part of the port during its heyday, you could spend hours walking around Liverpool's waterfront itself, with so much more to see than the few sights we've whizzed past today. However, we've now been touring the city of Liverpool for more than an hour and 20 minutes, and after an extensive exploration of what is undoubtedly one of the world's greatest and most historically fascinating cities, my legs are starting to get rather tired. So we've now come full circle on our walk around Liverpool, and as the sun has come out above us as we've walked up and down through the city streets, we'll be bringing this walk to an end back in front of the Three Graces. The buildings that showcase better than any the majestic power of Liverpool's world-beating port during its heyday, and which today stand as spectacular icons of the city looking out over Pier Head and the River Mersey, the Three Graces are just one part of the illustrious and enthralling history on display in Liverpool. On this walk, we've seen the place where the Beatles rose to fame in the 1960s, the site of Liverpool's long-lost medieval castle, the oldest Chinatown in Europe, one of the world's largest cathedrals, Second World War ruins, majestic Victorian architecture, huge shopping streets, and everything in between. And if all of that and more doesn't make Liverpool one of the best cities in the world to visit and explore, even on a simple stroll around the city like this, then I don't know what will. And so here, we've now come to the end of our epic walk around the magnificent maritime city of Liverpool. If you're still with us, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope you're looking forward to coming to Liverpool to explore all of these sights and more for yourself in future too.